Good afternoon. Is it working?
Hello, 1, 2.
A little closer to your mouth. Good afternoon. I'm going to ask you all to settle down and we're going to get started. My name is Elizabeth Say, and I am the Dean of the College of Humanities at Cal State Northridge. And I've been asked to do the introductions today. I want to thank the organizers of the Civil Discourse and Social Change Initiative for inviting me to introduce Reverend Lawson this afternoon. As you all know, today's lecture is part of a year-long, campus-wide endeavor to engage California State University Northridge faculty, staff, and students in addressing some of the major socioeconomic and philosophical challenges we face today, and to do so within the framework of nonviolent resistance. Last week, as was noted, we saw evidence of the fruit of these efforts as hundreds of our campus community marched in protest against cuts in state funding for higher education. They made their voices heard and did so with focused intent, but without violence, even though the overwhelming presence of the Los Angeles Police Department testified to concern in some quarters that violence would erupt. As a central feature of this campus initiative, Reverend James Lawson was invited to join CSUN for the year as a visiting faculty member. Reverend Lawson was a close associate of Dr. Martin Luther King and an integral part of the U.S. civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. He continues to be a fierce advocate against injustice in all forms. I am particularly delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Reverend Lawson because in 1984, he was the Brooks Visiting Professor at the University of Southern California. At that time, he was also pastor of the Holman United Methodist Church in Los Angeles, the vice president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the president of the Peace with Justice Leadership Conference. Coincidentally, I was a graduate student at USC, pursuing my PhD in religious social ethics. I was fortunate to spend an entire semester studying with Reverend Lawson, who taught a course on Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement for the School of Religion. It was a transformative experience for me. The opportunity to study one of the great figures of the 20th century with one who had been a collaborator in the struggle for human rights and social change. Reverend Lawson knew everyone who had been part of the movement, and we benefited from his knowledge. He brought to our classroom guest speakers such as C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, Bernard Lee, Dorothy Cotton, and Diane Nash, all colleagues of Dr. King's who played key roles in the movement. I was particularly inspired by Dorothy Cotton and Diane Nash, in large part because I knew so little at the time about the women who had made significant contributions to the civil rights movement, a movement which provided the playbook for the women's rights movement a decade later, opening doors that I was able to walk through. This is the topic of Reverend Lawson's talk today: Freedom's Daughters, Women's Struggles, and the Movement. Better than many, Reverend Lawson understands, because he was witness to and a champion of the early role of women activists, especially the important role they played in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We want to thank all those who contributed to make today's event a success. An event of this magnitude cannot happen without the cooperation and commitment of many people. So to the staff members who make it possible for us to meet in this beautiful venue, to those who are filming the event, to those who provide the catering for the reception, and of course to all the academic programs and departments, our heartfelt thanks. And now it's my honor to turn you over to Reverend James Lawson.
Thank you very much.
Is your mic on? Yeah.
How many would prefer being out at the beach or in the park this afternoon? Wonderful day, the nicest day we've had in 4 or 5 weeks, I think. And I don't relish being here that much myself, except that you are who you are, and I agreed to be here, and I'm delighted to do so, to be here. I've found you to be a very terrific group of people. I've met many students, many faculty people, administrators, and I've been particularly pleased with this opportunity because it represents an effort on the part of faculty and administration to open up your own thoughts and your own imaginations in the great variety of public conversations you are having here on campus, and that you'll have at home in your community and various other groups, and that you're going to have the rest of your lives. Because I don't know of anything that is quite as important, as serious, significant, and civil, helpful, healing, healthy conversation among us human beings. There's not a sufficient amount of it, and at present, you and I are receiving a very bad example in our own country where there's too much name-calling, too much ideology, too little looking at life as it is, too little awareness of what this 310 approximately million people of the United States look like, think like, what we feel like, what's going among us, what the issues are that are so important. Too little of a realistic picture of our humanity across creed, color, culture, gender, national origins, and a great variety of other complexities across all of that. The fundamental humanity that is ours, that is not only our gift, but our responsibility. So I'm delighted to be here. After the March 2nd event, how many of you were on it? Let's see the hands. Okay. A few of you were there. Good. I was there. I walked the distance. I'm pretty proud of myself at age 82. I walked the 30-something miles. and was recovered the next day very well. The last demonstration I participated in of this sort of last week was April the 19th in Nashville, Tennessee, where about 700 of us walked on a silent march. No noise, no drums, no trumpets, no slogan shouting. We walked about 3.5, 4 miles to demonstrate in Nashville something that had not been noticed for a long time, that we still had issues in Nashville that needed to be looked at and examined and talked about, and the rest of it. I'm particularly keen on being here this month that is Women's History Month. And a lot of people poke fun at things like Black History Month, Women's History Month. But perhaps many of you already know that I learned history in high school and college from the point of view of the victors, from the point of view of wars, from the point of view of the presidents. I learned very little in those years except by my own reading on history of women, history of Africa, history of religion, history of sociology. I learned very little on the history of the arts and the sciences and music. A part of the reason for this month is that the historians people who write the books have largely left out of the books something like 50% of the population. Now, how do you have a complete understanding of the human family at all if you don't have any significant understanding of maybe 51, 52% of the human family? If all you know about history are the military generals or the wars and the presidents who led those wars in the United States, then you have missed that which is really important. That is of most value. So part of Women's History Month is not just about recovering history that has been ignored, neglected. It's not just about reviewing what some of that history is about. That's important. But it's helping the human family recover a part of itself, its life, its values, its understanding, without which we cannot shape a different kind of world. One of the things that I've learned from women's history is this: that our present system in the world that can be called a dominator's system, and has been called by some scholars that, a dominator's system, a system of management and control, in which plantation capitalism and some of the forms of plantation capitalism, some of the political forms, social forms of that sort of capitalism, still seek to control and manage the world. And one of the contributions of reading from other points of view has been the recognition on my part, and the part of many scholars as well, that this system of management and control perhaps is only about 5,000 years old. It's not always existed. From my sociology and anthropology readings, I recognize that there are many forms in our past that were forms of egalitarianism, that is, of the equality of the genders, in which men did not primarily have the role as warriors, but had a more human role, a role more of nurturing and helping and caring. The present system under which we live has only been in existence maybe perhaps 5,000 years. I see traces of it as I read the scriptures, the Hebrew Christian scriptures. The emergence of the notion that kings and powerful people have a divine right. They have been ordained by God, that their power comes from God. I reject that notion as being unhistorical and inaccurate. I could give illustrations of it, which I will not do, but that whole emergence is not more than 5,000 years in the Hebrew Christian scriptures. Not more than 5,000 years at the most. And so the notion that the rich and the powerful, and that to gain power and to have power and to use it ruthlessly, to have wealth that you cannot even manage and use, that is greed, that is not the gift of God. That's the way in which, at a certain time, in the emergence of the human family, certain elements of society organized human life. Chase Bank, as one of the largest banks in the United States, itself responsible for some of the chaos in the economy, the joblessness in the economy, is not ordained of God. It was created by Americans who wanted wealth and wanted the power to dictate the shape of this nation through their wealth. It has no root in ethics, because greed historically, in most religions, is not a sign of virtue. Greed in Hebrew Christian traditions, in the Muslim world, greed is a sin. In Christian circles, especially at this time of the year in Christian circles, today is the beginning of Lent, Ash Wednesday, and many people who practice Christian ritual and spirituality will be looking at the issues of sin, and one of the major forms of looking at is through the notion of the 7 classic sins, of which greed is one. It's not seen in Christian theology, in Christian spirituality, as a human virtue worth acquiring. It is seen as a great despising of human life that ought to be rejected. So a part of our whole time together has been about this necessity of conversation and discourse, nonviolence, civil, social change, and the like. So Women's History is a good time for us men for the males in the United States and males in a university to give serious thought to how we have been perhaps misled in the kinds of history that we have acquired, and therefore the kinds of point of views that we have of our nation and the rest. A part of the whole purpose of my own life and thought and lecturing and activity is to try to persuade human beings that there are other options in the world than what is today current. There are other human options than Iraq and Afghanistan, and who are building military bases in Colombia or in Iraq or down the east coast of Africa. There are other options by which we can organize life and organize ourselves. So I do want to lift up as an initial point that I'm making this afternoon that Women's History Month is important for another essential reason, and that it can remind us, it should remind us that sexism still prevails as an ideological power and as a systemic and structural repression for women in the United States and around the world. We have not reached an egalitarian level of life, period. And it's my contention to say that boldly and plainly because it's not in public conversation. It's not in the halls of our legislature here in California, in the halls of Congress. It's not talked about as a part of the thing we need to understand and know about ourselves by the media, by Rush Limbaugh and others like him. It's seen as something that we deny, whereas in fact it's quite important if we're going to have a holistic conversation. We can never have the kind of world history we need, or the world history we'd like to make, so long as sexism continues to be kindled and rekindled in this generation. So I want to add that issue. Now, sexism has a very clear definition. It is the notion, by and large, and though some of the social studies blur this, I think, it is the notion, basically, historically, that the male species is the dominant an aspiring species, gender, and that life must be organized around the prevalence and the power and the dominance of the male. That the male is a superior part of human life, superior, that the female is the inferior facet of the human species. And this is not just an ideology, it has been built into so much of the way in which we operate. Towards the end of the 20th century, there was a growth in sexism as an ideology and as a system. And there was little government or public outcry or outrage. There was little or no media criticism. When the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, the Southern Baptist denomination, made as one of its central principles that all Baptists are supposed to follow, that the female is to be submissive to the male, that the wife is secondary to the husband must dominate. Now, the Southern Baptist Convention never had such a principle in their agreement before. They were like the rest of us, wandering around trying to figure out how to live with a sense of access and equality. But here suddenly in 1996, they proposed, and it was adopted in the convention, the submissiveness of the female, the dominance of the male. Pure sexism written into an agreement in a Protestant denomination of maybe 15, 16 million people. There was no outcry about that from anywhere. It was just taken as though that's normative behavior and should be the kind of thinking that a denomination is doing in the year of 1996. When in the spring of 2010, the Justice Department released its statistics on the killing of women in domestic violence in the United States, it announced in its gathering of statistics that at that point, 5 women a day are killed by an intimate male or ex-intimate male. I did not see in any newspaper, the Los Angeles Times or the Nashville Tennessean, any analysis of what this meant about the children or any analysis of what that meant in terms of a violent society. Did any of you see that report in the press? It was in the print press. No one saw that report. Huh? This was in the spring of 2010. I saw it in 2 print press. I've not seen any major statement about it since. 5 women a day are killed. Now, see, that's statistics larger than Iraq and Afghanistan together, right? And it's going on in our country. These were stats not from around the world, but just from our land. The Justice Department is supposed to collect those annually from around the country and unravel them and unpack them for the nation. 5 a day. I have not since that time seen any major print analysis of what that report means. So when I speak about nonviolence often, I'm not really that much concerned with Iraq and Afghanistan as I am with the United States. I don't count myself as a pacifist. I'm a nonviolent practitioner. I am persuaded that you must have a serious critique of what violence does to people, violence of speech, as well as the violence of the hand or fist or the gun or the knife. So that a part of the reality of our time, in my judgment, is that we are dealing with entrenched and continuous sexism that is ideological, but that is also systemic. 5 a day, that's in the structures of America. It's not primarily a family's responsibility. Though you can say families have responsibility, men and women have responsibility, but it is a structural business that has not accumulated because some president has caused it, or even because the Congress or state legislature has formed it. It has accumulated over decades of neglect of our humanity and care for our humanity on the one side, and then the permission to allow certain kinds of criminal behavior to become normative behavior. Does that make sense at all to anyone besides me? What I'm trying to say is that this is an issue that you cannot put the finger of blame on somebody. Each of us can take responsibility to root out of our lives such sexism in language, in thought, and in behavior. At that point, each of us can play a role in the matter. But we have to see the issue as larger than ourselves. It is a national, social, economic, political, psychological, spiritual, religious issue that somehow has gotten itself rooted in our common life in such a fashion that we see it as being ordinary and normative, nothing to protest, nothing to examine and to unpack for ourselves to talk about it, and certainly not a conversation piece in various kinds of circles. Let me give you another example of sexism before I move on. The anti-abortion agencies in our society are in large measure anti-women agencies and sexist agencies. I've been amused but dismayed to see the number of elected officials in Iowa. I haven't met them yet in California, in Tennessee, in our Congress, who ran on a platform about economic opportunity and jobs. But the first bills they have proposed in Iowa, in Washington, D.C., are bills to limit abortion in the United States. Now, everyone is in favor of limiting abortion in some fashion. I suspect that all of us have that notion in mind. But what I'm trying to decry here is not a personal sensibility about abortion. What I'm decrying is that the male-dominated agencies that are pushing to kill doctors who serve women in a great variety of their medical needs, who have health clinics for women, I'm pushing against the men and their agencies who call these health clinics abortion clinics, and who create a climate of hostility both against the doctors and the nurses and their staffs, and then try to impose the notion that reproduction rights must be governed by the society and by government and not by the values of women themselves, that they should have no say in it. It should be the government and the men, we men, who take this position. And what these anti-abortion agencies are largely about, in my judgment, is to form the public discussion in such a fashion that they think they will put women back in the genie jar. Women have basically never been there, but their notion is that changes have occurred so by which women have too much power, too much agency, and we must manage and control them. So what I'm saying to you is something fairly radical that you have never heard. I'm saying that the anti-abortion forces in the United States are not committed to issues of conception and the fetus. They are committed to somehow putting in new fabric of oppression and repression of women in the United States. The inalienable right of every human being is to have certain management and control of your own body as well as your own soul. To be able to make decisions and choices that you take responsibility for. And the same is true in the issue, in my judgment, of abortion. The agencies for women, I maintain, are too quiet about some of these matters. Even the national organizations have not mounted a counter-attack to the assault to turn women into primarily creatures at the hands of the management of the male. Now, the civil rights movement did set a different example, if I say so myself. And the issue wasn't so much the absence of sexism or the absence of domination over women. That was not the issue. The issue in the movement in 1955, 1965, 1970 was dismantling racism, which we haven't achieved in doing, dismantling its sexism, dismantling its economic deprivation, dismantling the violence of racism. That was the critical issue. Dismantling Jim Crow law, dismantling public segregation and public hostility. That was the issue. But the movement would not have taken a major direction of mass, direct, nonviolent action had it not been for decisions that certain women made early on that shaped the direction of the movement. I want to repeat what I just said, and I'm going to illustrate this then very briefly. That the movement took certain directions for mass, nonviolent direct action because of decisions early on that certain women made in especially the southeastern part of the country as the direct action movement began to emerge. As all sorts of people began to say, I can act in concert with my neighbors to make a difference and to bring the changes we need. I've made that statement. I stand by it. The movement would not have taken the direction it took in the early years as the movement was emerging, as Martin Luther King's name became a household name, a name that was known in Africa, Latin America, in Asia alike, would not have happened had it not been for certain women who took major action to move towards what the movement became. And let me now document this in two ways for you. The first one. There were preliminary things in the struggle in the 50s, such as the May 17, 1954 Supreme Court decision of the unconstitutionality of segregation in education, that it could not be constitutional. It could not be equal education. That was a unanimous decision made May 17, 1954. The movement up to that time was still largely directed in terms of legal action in the courts to secure the changing of law by the court. But on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a seamstress and a member of an AME church in Montgomery, Alabama, decided that she was not going to get up and move at the request of the bus driver and actually she was to get up and then stand, give her seat to a white man who got on the bus. She decided not to do it. The driver called the police and she was arrested. And in Montgomery, Alabama, the city and the state laws said that riding a bus inside a city, the buses must be segregated. And what this did, among other things, was it caused the company and the city to become much more of a hostile environment, especially for black people, and in particular for black women. Many illustrations of this in the stories of people from Montgomery, Alabama in that year and in previous years. Well, when this happened on that fateful Friday, a woman who went immediately into action about it was a woman who was an English professor at Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University in Montgomery. Her name was Joanne Robinson. She was the chairperson of what was called the Women's Political Committee, Council they called it, not a committee, the Women's Political Council. It had been organized about 3 years before, and its major concern was the segregated buses and the hostility and crudity, insults that were leveled on black people in Montgomery by white bus drivers. And there had been letters to the company. There had been meetings with the mayor, the city commission, and none of that had worked. The Women's Political Council was a key figure in organizing around that effort. Well, on December 1st, Joanne Robinson went into action. Without asking anyone besides some of her own colleagues and friends and committee members, she decided to issue a letter that would call for a one-day boycott on Monday, the 5th of December. Now, she had written before to the city government saying, maybe we need to do a boycott. Maybe a year before that, or 2 years before that. She had talked in the Women's Political Council about the necessity of taking some direct action, that a lawsuit was not enough, that perhaps a massive action of some kind would do it. And then she joined with students and other colleagues from Alabama A&M, and they did mimeograph sheets that they printed all night Friday night. We didn't have, at that time, as you know, we didn't have a computer and printers. Did it by mimeograph. And so this was an all-night task. And they put these little half sheets of 8 by 11s that they cut in half about the boycott on Monday in little bundles, and they proceeded early in the morning to distribute those throughout the city. The net result was that she sowed the seeds for direct action that everyone could participate in. And the rest of that is in part history. She did become a part of the executive committee of the Montgomery Improvement Association, of which Martin Luther King Jr. was elected president. She became one of the major organizers of the boycott for 381 days. And I want to say about that it was not divided up. It was a unified effort. There were high school students involved in walking and boycotting the buses, college students from Alabama A&M, all sorts of people of every generation who participated in that bus boycott. As a consequence of that, Martin King was made the spokesperson for it, moved it into thinking about itself creatively, moved it to the place where he called it nonviolent struggle, direct action, as over against purely legal action, and became the spokesperson for the nonviolent mass action that began to emerge with that Montgomery bus boycott in December of 1955. Now, what I'm saying to you is something that maybe you know or you do not know, that the movement that we celebrate and talk about did not come already prepared and developed. It came as a historical, social movement of ordinary people like those of us gathered here. But Joanne Robinson's action, Rosa Parks' action, set the tone and made a major decision that became a model for many, many people. I heard about it while in Nagpur, India. I was elated by the news. 50,000 people determined they would take matters into their own hands and not throw stones, which is an American custom, but decided they would stay off the buses with their own bodies. They would walk. They would encourage their families to organize around the boycott. They would make it work until major change had taken place. So it was women who made that decision. But after the bus boycott went around the world. Many people were excited about the fact of this kind of mass action. But then the question was, does it work? Will it work again? And how do you manage to put it in place? And so again, I want to describe how the second stage came along, the second campaign, that convinced still another realm of people that nonviolent action had arrived if we could learn much more about its theory and practice and strategy. And I move you to 1960 because no major campaign took place between 1957 rather, and 1959. And in Nashville, Tennessee, there were a group of us clergy and lay people and women who asked ourselves the question, what is the next stage for direct action? What is the next stage where we don't rely upon a court or a legislature, we organize ourselves to make another dent in this matter of racism and its concomitant wrongs? And I was asked to organize a series of meetings in Nashville. And what I put those meetings to do was very simple. We talked about all the issues that were on the minds of black people in Nashville at that time with segregation and inequality. And for about 6 months, on a Saturday morning, for 2 or 3 hours, 30 to 60 of us gathered just to talk about what the situation is here in Nashville, and is there some place where we can find the beginning point to act in the manner of the Montgomery bus boycott, in the manner of direct action. Is there some way that we can mobilize and organize ourselves to go after these issues of Jim Crow law and practice? Well, none of us had an idea how that conversation would end. I had no such idea. I was the Southern Secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, traveling in crisis situations around the South. I had the privilege of working with the Little Rock Nine in Central High School and with 100 or so other students in that school who were in a crisis situation for 9 months in 58, 59 in the academic year of 58, 59. I did workshops for Martin King in places like Columbia, South Carolina, in places like Montgomery, Alabama, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and elsewhere, teaching nonviolent struggle, not from simply the point of Gandhi, but from the point of view of the American Revolutionary period, which many people don't know about, but from the point of view of the anti-slavery movement of the 1830s, the 1840s, from the point of view of activists from colleges and universities in places like Los Angeles, California in 1942, University of Chicago in 1942, 43, where activists went and desegregated restaurants and skating rinks and theaters that refused to allow Japanese or Hispanics or Chinese or black people to enter them and partake of the services. Here in Los Angeles, it was a department store called Bullock's that would not serve black people in the tea room. And it was students and adults in Los Angeles who organized in 42 a sit-in campaign that went into Bullock's and sat in an integrated fashion, and sat in, called for a boycott of the Bullock's department store, that's now Macy's, until the store changed its policy and served the whole public. This is Los Angeles history, 1942, 43. So I knew about some of these things and taught them, shared that kind of work that went on in the United States itself. But in 1959, we did not know how to proceed. And it was women, and I'll name two of them precisely. Johnetta Hayes, a very lovely, petite black woman, always wore a hat to meetings, wore gloves, very genteel soul, a southern drawl, but a gentle voice that could be a very persistent voice on describing her experiences in downtown Nashville. Or Dolores Wilkerson, who was a public nurse, or Helen Roberts. And these were three of the women that I recall very well, who I came to know in the next several years in Nashville, who said we should begin a campaign to desegregate downtown Nashville. We should get those signs down. We should get signs that said white only, colored only. We should get restaurants opened up, theaters opened up. We should desegregate the places where we have to shop and where often we are treated with indignities and insults. So the decision was made by this group of us that we called ourselves the Nashville Christian Leadership Council, that we were going to take action of a nonviolent kind and develop mass action to change the face of Nashville by starting not at school desegregation or in the courts, but by starting in the heart of the city and pull the signs down, change the climate for all of the people of Nashville, but especially for black people who were the major recipients of the cruelty and torture of segregation in Nashville. We did an A to Z process. We did not make any priority lists. We did not try to control the conversation. The black women who were present were very talkative. They shared with us fully their experience. And the net result was that we did something that no one had even thought about doing. No community of people had sat down together to talk about their own urban situation and how they could begin to make changes. We hadn't even figured out that such a project could be adopted for social action and could be successful. But because of the impact of the women in our midst, we made the decision deliberately to desegregate the downtown of the city of Nashville. And we drew up an action plan of sit-ins, of economic boycott, of picket walks, of negotiations, of recruiting and training people, of recruiting students, recruiting others to become the folk who would act, to go through a kind of a boot camp program for a minimum of 3 or 4 months in which we compared ourselves to being engaged in military action, and where I taught the whole business of how there's a similarity between a military action and a nonviolent action. Similarity in terms of discipline. Similarity in terms of developing a plan and a strategy. Similarity in terms of knowing what the objectives were. Similarity in physical training, mental training for the military objective, in our case, a civilian objective downtown. So when today, for an example, you read something about that, and you see the movement that went on from 1960, 1961, 1968, 1973, and you name and hear names like Congressman John Lewis from Atlanta, or like Diane Nash from Angelina Butler, or Lester McKinney. Some of these names you know, others are names that you do not know and will not know. You're talking about the second major campaign that solidified the notion in the United States as well as in Europe and Africa that nonviolent action could create the climate for social change and for new approach in this country. We are talking this year about what happened in Egypt, where indeed, from what I have read and what I've trying to study and learning more about it, Egyptian people were fed up. Millions of young people, more than half of the population of Egypt is under 30. More than half of the population is under 30. tens of thousands of students who have college degrees and graduate degrees but have no jobs, must postpone developing a family because the society is so underdeveloped and undeveloped. They cannot find work either in their fields or in related fields or in just fields which will allow them to support themselves and support a future family. And they use as their method, essentially, vigilant mass direct action support. Not legislative, not the courts, but basically going to the streets. I'm learning more about this, I hope, in the next 30 days to learn much more about it. I know one or two people who are on the streets of Cairo. I'm collecting reports from Europe and elsewhere. They help to describe the process by which Cairo became a massive direct action civil resistance that changed and has changed now the face of North Africa and the face of Egypt. And I can simply say to you that in the movement of which I was a part, and in future movements, the issue of the equality of women and the role and work and life of the women must be seen on the same level as the work of men. In this whole business of how we change our state to support your public education, to support education, to let babies and children and young people become the primary budget of the state of California and of the whole country, and to make your education a world-class opportunity for learning and access to it, something that all can have in every state of the Union. In that task, women and men must be seen as equal and must work together in an equal fashion. And it's my contention that the option that we human beings have, such as we have not imagined, is the nonviolent option. That through nonviolence, especially its insistence that each one of us is of infinite worth and that each one of us has great power, and especially its notion that we can link that power hand to hand, and that whole notion that we have power, you have power, you are not impotent, you have life. Life itself is power. Life itself is love and truth. That life itself can direct your life in such a fashion that you can not only be the person you seek to be, but you can see the real options for yourself and for others. Thank you. Yes.
Hang on one second. We're ready for a break, and we actually will have food set up outside for you in just a couple of moments. We're working on setting that up right now. I want to invite Justice White to come up and give a few announcements about things that are coming. Just hang on. Hold on for just a second. Justice, will you join us?
About to take a break in 1 minute, but I just have a question. How many people in this room like hip-hop and poetry? Raise your hand. Make some noise if you like hip-hop and poetry.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. My question is, what is your critique on the role of violence in achieving social justice and its perceived flaws?
Oh, where is the question's right here? Yeah, okay. I thought it was up there.
Did you wanted to stand up and ask again, or you?
Yeah, go ahead, do that.
So my question was, what is your critique on the role of violence in achieving social progress and its perceived flaws?
Well, that's a very big, huge question, very big question. I think if you look back over the last 30, 40 years, you have almost no illustrations, historical illustrations, where violence has been efficacious in creating justice or social change or democracy. There's almost none. Last week at the march, I came to recognize that a group that calls itself the Revolutionary Workers' Party, is that right? Was active in the demonstration. They came to the demonstration. They consider themselves a Marxist revolutionary group, and they do parrot the mythology that revolution comes through violence, and that violence is the way by which most effective change takes place. But their position is an ideological position. It's a political platform that they have that they cannot validate in the last 30 years. You can say, on the other side of the coin, that the places in the world where there have been nonviolent revolutions have made the most progress towards justice and social change, towards the equality of women, towards the dismantling of the wrong that they needed to dismantle, and towards making steps. Democracy is a notion that is relatively new, that we human beings have the capacity to govern ourselves and to shape our lives and to shape our society. And that governments that we create should help us do that. Violence is a contrary perspective to that view of democracy. That's what I have to say. A third suggestion I make is this, that we have used almost $1 trillion in Afghanistan and $1 trillion in Iraq so far. Afghanistan is the longest war we have ever fought. If you'd put the human resources, the technological resources, the financial resources that we put into Afghanistan only, into public education in the United States, you resolve the issues of finances in public education and in the university. Just those resources that have been spent there. The economic difficulty the United States is facing is precisely because the United States Congress and presidents, and especially big business, have used war and violence as a way of management and control in the world, and not because it has been supportive of justice or democratic processes. I say finally about that violence is one of the enemies of the human race. And that now in the 21st century, we must begin to understand that before the violence we do to ourselves, to our earth, to our planet, and to one another becomes what? Pushes us past the point of no return. Pushes us past the point of no return.
Hang on one sec. We need to use the microphone because then it will be webcast. So I'll hand you the microphone.
All right.
Okay.
And you're next, and you're next. I see two women's hands, and then we'll go way up in the back. Three. All right, go ahead.
Okay. What are the institutions in society that you think it's most important to target, like, with protests or whatever, in order to get at the structural reproduction of sexism? And then just sort of as a secondary idea with that, do you think that targeting institutions like this can heal an issue that has become so ingrained in culture, like on an individual basis of people?
What are the institutions that we need to target to deal with an issue like sexism?
Yes.
Institutional and otherwise? It's a very good question, and I'm not sure how to respond to it. All right, my bottom line point of view is that in the United States, we need in the 21st century a series of campaigns like that which took place in Egypt. That are aimed not primarily at certain institutions per se, but are aimed at changing the consciousness of our society and helping the American people see that we have to raise up a whole new series of institutions in order to do justice to our own ideals of freedom, equality, and so forth. So I don't see the targeting process as much as I see the need for a revolutionary movement better than what went on in Egypt, and more strategically planned and prepared for. But I think meantime, each of us can fight the issues of sexism, most of all by understanding what these issues are and seeing to it that we're on the side of the dismantling of sexism. That how we want to live and how we will act and think and how we'll organize our families will be a part of the new spirit that is necessary for the change we need as a people. There are incremental things that can be done. We can propose that in California the legislature and the governor agree that the disparity in income between women who work and men who work, the disparity so that women make something like 70-odd cents, 80 cents on a dollar to what men make for comparable work, that those disparities can be eradicated and eliminated. There's legislation that could be done, that could be proposed, and that may be important to work on it. But even for that legislature, I'm convinced the way to get it done is by actions similar to Cairo, rather than lobbying the Congress, which I don't think is a very effective way. And it's not a good way for people to express their power, the power we do have as people. Yes, ma'am, right here.
This is in regards to the anti-abortion you spoke about. I was just wondering if you think government is viewing women to be irresponsible.
Beg pardon?
I was just wondering if you think government is viewing women to be irresponsible with their children. That's why they're canceling the agency.
Well, when we talk about governments, we're talking about we, the American people, because what's going on in Iowa, as an example, Kansas, those are folk who've been elected by the people of those states. I maintain that issues of reproductive life and all are medical, personal, family issues and ought to be decided in that arena and not in the arena of the Vatican or the arena of legislators who are anti-abortion. They're anti-abortion because they've not looked at the issue carefully. They have not dealt with their own daughters, their own wives, period. They are squeezing out their own humanity. I say that very deliberately and concretely, that those legislators are folk who are, they've forgotten that they were born to be human beings. And they have tried to squeeze out of their bloodstream what it means to be a person, what it means to be a woman or a man. That's my take. That's on this. Way in the back now. There we go. Not way in the back, but in the bleachers.
Okay. It seems like our generation is kind of disconnected to implementing social change. Collectively, people are not as passionate about today's issues as people have been in the past. What advice would you give our generation on how to change that?
So are you saying that you see a lot of apathy among your peers at the CSUN or in your neighborhood where you live?
I'm speaking in general, of our generation in general. When there's an issue, not everybody stands up like they used to, like when in the boycott, how the whole community came together and they fought. Now it's a few people speak and only a couple come out to support. I want to know what advice would you give our generation on how to change that?
Well, I think, number one, your generation has not been exposed to the challenges that would allow you to stand up together in common cause. So that's one item. I mean, I was saying in one of the other lectures that they called the generation of the 60s the same thing. But as soon as the development of the sit-in campaign in 1960, 59 and 60 took place, then they were saying that the generation was aggressive, militant, revolutionary, all of the kinds of things about that student generation of the 1960s, you see. So the issue was the challenges that were available and to which people could link themselves. Now, I think that every student generation has to consider its responsibility of preparation. That's why you're in school. You have to consider that responsibility, and you have to follow your leanings there. But the things that you are passionate about in relationship to your community, your school, yourself, 99 chances out of 100, other people around you are just as passionate in those issues. And in the right spark, you may see all of that come together in a major campaign. I guess what I'm pushing for most is that you in the present student generation do not underestimate who you are and where your place is in life now and what the possibilities are for yourself. There are two more hands up there, Catherine, and then I see hands generally. So we have only one microphone? All right. All right. Okay, yes.
First, Reverend Lawson, I'd just like to thank you for coming to speak to us today. You spoke of all your accomplishments and all the things that you've seen in your life. I was just wondering what's next on your to-do list. What would you like to accomplish next?
Where did you see this? Where did you see this list?
No, I was just wondering what was on your to-do list. Like, what was your, it's in your mind, not written.
It's on your website, Reverend Lawson.
Beg pardon?
It's on your website. I'm teasing you.
Okay. Well, what I see myself trying to do most of all is to prepare the soil for the 21st century nonviolent efforts in the United States that can move us from where we are, where we were, and where we are, to where we need to be. I happen to think that the American people, we the American people, are not being treated very well by our institutions and by a lot of our leadership. When the Republican Party gets elected to Congress and becomes the majority party in the House and narrows the difference in the Senate, and then change their whole approach to the country from what they claimed to then social issues, divisive issues, I think that is a part of the depth of the gap. So I feel that we need movements now like the women's movement of 1914, the working people's movement of 1930s, and this what is called the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And must be better planned and do better work, but that's the future. If we're going to have a society where the aspirations of people and your aspirations are going to be achievable. So that's where I am. That's what I'd like to see happen most. That's what I'd like to participate in most. All right, let's move around. We've had two women in a row. Now here's a man here. And here's another one here, okay. Maybe let's hear 2 or 3 questions and see if they connect with each other in a row. Yeah.
All right, so I'll focus the question on the particular topic in the month that we're dealing with. So I know we were having some general questions. So historically, I think we've seen that social movements have benefited from the participation of women in these social movements towards progress. But I think I get the sense that once this change is created, women have not been incorporated into the decision-making in the process of moving forward after the change has been made. So I think, as I've been following up with the Egypt thing, primarily my news has been coming from Democracy Now! And there was a part of the reporting that touched on women's involvement in the protest, but also their involvement in the decision-making when individuals and groups are trying to move forward. And it seems like the women have not been incorporated. So society benefits from women being involved in the social movements, but then they're left out at the decision-making table. So my question is, how can this patriarchal system or structure be dissolved, and do you see it happening in this generation or ever?
All right. That's a good question. That's a good question, too. Now, there's another male over in here. Something. Okay, yes.
Good afternoon. Just curious about what do you think the role of social media will play in the future of nonviolent movements and the search for social justice here in the States? Do you think it's going to be very impactful? Not so much? What's your personal perspective on that?
All right. Let's take a Third question over here.
Hello. I was just wondering how you would compare today's efforts for civil change to those that you participated in during the 60s and the original civil rights movement.
Different question. I'm a gender women's studies major, and I find that most of the time when I talk about social issues, I do so with people that share those same political beliefs. And yet I know there are people out there that think things like feminism is a farce, homophobia is acceptable, racism is dead. But, you know, my favorite feminist, for example, she once said that talking to some people is like talking to a toilet. And I would have to agree at times. So my question would be, what are some suggestions for us to sit down with people that we might normally not talk to and have them see that all people are deserving of equal rights and respect?
All right, let me cut in here now for a moment, and then we'll come back to her. All right, it is true we have not had substantial structural change. That's period. And that's why we need movements. That's why we need nonviolent movements like what happened in Egypt, in the United States, that will force structural change in the United States. The Senate in the United States is made up entirely of millionaires, a handful of women. It probably ought to be at least 50% women. But until we change the structure of Congress, the structures of the political parties, that's not going to happen. Now, there are some places, someone tell me about this, I can't remember which country it is now. Is it Germany or France? Where they have decreed by law that every corporation, every political, social board of any kind in the society must have on it by a certain year 40% women. Who is that that's done that? It wasn't advertised in the United States, but it's either Germany or France. It might have been one of the...
I think it's one of the Scandinavian.
Beg pardon?
Reverend Lawson, I think it's, is it Sweden? I thought it was one of the Scandinavian countries.
Is it Sweden?
Maybe. We'll check on it. We've got some internet access here.
Some country has written a major piece of legislature that says that all university boards, all corporate boards must become, by a certain time, 40% women. That the women must be present in the decision-making bodies of the country. It might be Sweden. I can't remember. Huh?
Mumbai says the state government will introduce legislation mandating 50% electoral.
Who?
Mumbai says. That's the first headline I found.
Mumbai?
Yes.
You mean India?
They're trying to do it at 30% of all elected seats at different...
They wrote into the Constitution way back in 46, 47, they wrote into the Constitution certain percentages of women who should be at sentence. Why do you say Mumbai? Does India call itself Mumbai?
It's how it was.
Bombay, you know.
I know that's the area around, used to be Bombay.
Maybe they're just talking about the city government in Mumbai.
It's a regional government, it's a provincial government then, Mumbai, on the west coast of India. Okay, used to be Bombay.
And then it says 33% reservation in the assembly.
Uh-huh, in that state. Mm-hmm.
They're trying to do it across India.
Right, but there's a European country. Huh? Norway? Brit, you say it's Norway? Okay. Is there more than one country in Europe that started that process? Uh-huh. Okay. So, yeah. So, yes, you're right. But I want to be sure you understand that none of the movements in the 20th century or the women's movements or working people's movements have moved for a follow-up process whereby even in their own agencies, women have a strong percentage of representation. That simply has not happened as a whole. But that simply is what must happen in the 21st century. I have no doubt about it. But now I want to raise another issue. Of what value is it to have women, of what value is it to have women or people of color in positions of power if they're going to operate by status quo politics? Huh? Of what value is it? So something else has to go on, I would suppose. All right, we'll come back to you. Uh-huh. Yes.
It kind of related to her question about how do you talk to and convey your point to people who have different views. So my question was, how can I unify CSUN students around the slaughter of their education budget, and how can I make them realize that it's all of our struggle?
All right. Now, from a nonviolent struggle and tactic perspective, there is something that I call one-on-one struggle. And what that means is that at a certain place in organizing, there is no substitute for each of the organizers to work at a one-on-one basis of organizing. That is certainly an initial stage of organizing. So in response to your issue, if those of you who are actively engaged in organizing on the issues of the budgets and all, you all need to determine that you're going to go after a list of names that you put together of people who you'd like to see engaged. And you assign those people to different ones of you on a one-on-one basis for one-on-one conversation, telephone call, Facebook, whatever. I don't think Facebook is as good as eyeball to eyeball, face to face. And you experiment with how you help that person come on board as their own decision, not your decision, but as their own decision. Now that can be very wonderful work, incidentally. It can be very exciting work. It can be very frustrating work, but it can also be extremely exciting. In some of the organizing that I've helped do in Los Angeles area, that is one of the places where this whole idea is developed in my own head and mind and work. Some 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was working assiduously with Maria Elena Durasso, who is now the Secretary-Treasurer of the Labor Council in Los Angeles and a long-term associate of mine. And we were finding in hotels especially, but also in restaurants, workers who were so fearful of losing their jobs, so fearful of the coercion being put upon them by supervisors and managers and whatnot in hotels, that they wouldn't even come close to any kind of organizer to talk about it. They were in such fear. And what we developed was a system of not doing organizing at the hotel, but getting the names of workers where they lived and one-on-one, visiting them in their home, in their neighborhood, and not visiting them to persuade them that they needed to have a union initially, because you have to deal with their fear, their anxiety. You have to deal with their personal issues. And so the thing was to then, for the one-on-one visitation by an organizer of the union, Local 11, and this worker in fear, was to start one-on-one conversations and face-to-face issues to help the worker express their situation and face their anxieties and their fears. And then to do that one-on-one in such a fashion that the worker, in fear and anxiety, would come to a point of truth for themselves, whereby they would be very willing to begin to talk about that fear in their family and down the road with other people and with other workers. So that one-on-one kind of organizing in all situations, just about to get something moving, a lot of that one-on-one work is what is necessary to get to point B. Very often you can't get to point B until a lot of people are doing that one-on-one work. Does that make any kind of sense? So I maintain that one-on-one discipline is one of the things that you and I have to do as a normal course of life. If we're interested in social change, we have to do that with some people who we may not like, who may be our enemies, who are not willing to take the risk for themselves, and so forth and so on. And that in doing it, we will we help to lay the groundwork for the work that can be done down the road. And it's a good way of testing yourself too, testing who you are and what you're about. It helps you to, it's helped me personally as a pastor, for an example. That one-on-one work has helped me greatly to see people's issues outside of dogma. outside of the dogma of often of Christianity. The ideologies that are not functional, that really don't work, but to see people on their own terms and to see where they are. So it's helped me to be much more flexible as a pastor. Yes, Justin?
I want to thank you again. And as I was listening to your response to the young lady's question in the bleachers, I heard you describe a certain type of spark that is the catalyst for some of these movements, and I think I, like you, have a faith, kind of like in our generation, and knowing that we are a certain type of people that does have a stronger amount of empathy than apathy, but that it takes that certain type of spark. So I guess my question to you is, what are the characteristics of that type of spark, that spark like Rosa Parks or something like that happened in Egypt, given that times have changed? Is there like a base level set of characteristics for that type of catalyst of social movements in smaller regions?
Well, I'm not sure that you can say that there are a set of rules or a set of criteria for that spark. I'm not sure you can do that. You mentioned Rosa Parks. Well, Rosa Parks was actively engaged as a church person. She was actively involved. She was the she was the adult who worked with the NAACP youth chapter in Montgomery. She she was a seamstress who worked publicly in a department store. She had friends like Edie Nixon, who was the NAACP chair at one time in Montgomery. She had gone to a whole series of community meetings on issues facing the community and facing herself. She had a week in Highland and Folk School in Tennessee that was her first desegregated, integrated experience in life, period. That was eye-opener for her. That gave her a whole different sense. She had taken insults a couple of times on the buses. One time from the same driver who had her arrested on December 1st, 1955. That name is available. So her life was a life of activism and courage and character in a very, very tough situation. I started to use today a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. because I was rereading this book recently. This book is Stride Toward Freedom by Martin King, which is a story of the Montgomery movement. And he describes Rosa Parks, why she refused to move, and lots of things that were written about that. Mrs. Parks' refusal to move back was her intrepid affirmation that she had had enough. It was an individual expression of a timeless longing for human dignity and freedom. She was anchored to that seat by the accumulated indignities of days gone by and the boundless aspirations of generation yet born. So that's how he describes the spark, and I hadn't remembered this until I hadn't remembered his description there of that something welled up in her, and she just simply had the courage to remain seated and to say, you do what you're going to do. So it seems to me that the spark is in part nurtured and cultivated and developed by our acting out of our best instincts for truth and justice. Acting out of our best instincts of compassion for people and applying that not only in our own daily lives, in the daily activity, and the spark emerges for different ones of us at different places and at different times. But it does come out of an activist effort personally to be alive and human. It does come out of that. All right?
Reverend Lawson, I've been inspired by watching the union workers in Wisconsin over the last week and the Democratic senators who left the state, so they were not confronted, did not have to be confronted with the legislation that was being put in front of them. And clearly something was sparked in them, both the group of union workers who sat in at the House of Congress in Wisconsin. We haven't seen that level of demonstration in many, many years, for people to just go and sit in and sleep in and stay, and for people to leave the state so they don't have to enact something that they know will be unfamiliar or unjust. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on in Wisconsin, if you followed any of that?
I'm not really following Wisconsin that well. I know the issue that you described. The Democratic senators are outnumbered so that they have no way of fighting very, very bad legislation. And if they are in the Senate, the Republicans will force through the issue quickly, overwhelmingly, and it will have no opposition. So in one way, they're engaged in a kind of a nonviolent action by not giving the Senate a quorum, which it seems to me is something that legislators need to get involved in doing. because too much bad legislation is being passed, is being proposed in all kinds of subjects. So perhaps we need from our elected officials some show like similar to that in Wisconsin, some show that we're going to fight on other grounds. We can't outvote you, but we will fight back by withdrawing our presence so that you have to do what you want to do that's wrong on your own terms, but you will not have our presence to help you do it. So it seems to me it is an important effort. It was done by legislators in Texas some years ago against the president. It was, I think Bush was governor, and then Perry was governor, and Democratic legislators walked out in the same way. But that's the kind of nonviolent struggle and action that we have to have much more of in the United States on many, many different grounds, on many, many different fronts. That's no doubt about that in my judgment.
Thank you, Reverend Lawson. It isn't often, as I approach 80 years, that I'm able to pay respects to an elder. I was something that's kind of bothered me. My wife and I have lived in some barrios, mixed race, poor areas, and I have extended to the children that I met there, tutoring, especially mathematics. Even though I'm a registered nurse, I also have a degree in mathematics and philosophy. And while I receive a very positive response from the Latino parents and from the Asian parents, like there was a Hmong family right next door to us who just ate up everything. I tried to help them with their schoolwork, but I found antagonism coming from black parents when I tried to help their children. I mean, antagonism's too gentle a word. It was threats of violence, and I'm going, I heard some words by Bill Cosby that sometimes, maybe the worst people to help their own race seem to be the members of the race. Why were they so antagonistic about learning algebra or science? I mean, x equals 11 and y equals 12, and deductive falsification has nothing to do with race. That's science.
Well, maybe you have to use different strategy, different approach. Now remember now that in relationship to the black community, that their experience is vastly different in the United States from the Japanese and from also Mexican Americans. The black parents have been the major brunt of the animosity of the whole society.
I'm just trying to teach algebra.
Okay, but you're also teaching within the context of 3 or 4 different cultural areas, and you're assuming that the same response ought to come from vastly different perspectives.
So you're admitting to an anti-intellectualism in the black community?
No. I'm talking about the level of hostility that they have developed out of whatever their racial situation has been, their past. That can be radically different from all the other youngsters that you're talking about.
This isn't a mixed neighborhood.
Huh?
These are in mixed neighborhoods.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The mixed neighborhood means only that you bring people in from different connections into a neighborhood, but they bring with them their own cultural ethos, their own circumstances. And if those circumstances have been radically racist, no matter where they're living now, those circumstances are still going to dictate to them their response to you.
So they're trapped. They can't see. They can't see outside their experiences.
Huh? What's that?
You're saying they're trapped. They can't see
They're trapped?
outside their experiences.
I'm saying that it's a deeper level of racism that you have met, that you have to contend with if you're going to get the responses you want. And it's not connected
Well, actually, I'd love a non-response. That'd be better than being threatened.
Well, that's not an anti-intellectual situation. It is some people who've been deeply wounded.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just going to add to that. One of the things that I always say is that we don't really only teach the subject matter, we teach people.
Yeah.
So we may teach algebra, but we have to think very carefully about who we're teaching in the relationship. And I think that Reverend Lawson is asking us to dig in deeper to understand the conditions from which the people who are responding to you that way were coming. And that will help in the process of teaching them better. No, I don't think it's about
Their antagonism does not come from you. Their antagonism comes from their very, very human experience that you have to try to understand and shape your approach accordingly.
And on that note, we're going to have to close simply because this hall is used at 7 and we have only got it till 6:30. Let's give Reverend Lawson another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
For those of you who asked questions, there are books here, A Course More Powerful, for you to pick up with Reverend Lawson.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you for your Easter. It was nice meeting you.
Huh? Good.
Thank you for
Thank you
coming.
for your question. That's all right. Thank you. All right.